Hi, welcome to our next unit. We're moving on from global prehistory and we're going to be moving into ancient Mediterranean art. The first unit is going to be dealing with ancient Near Eastern art. And this is art that is found in a region known as Mesopotamia. You've probably heard of this in your social studies classes or geography classes. This is known as the cradle of civilization. So in this unit, we're going to be looking at art and also different themes concerning war, peace, and this notion of authorial vision in the art of Mesopotamia. So you might hear me kind of go back and forth between using those terms, ancient Near Eastern art and Mesopotamian art. They mean the same thing. And often I'll abbreviate ancient Near East with ANE. So, the cradle of civilization. So, Mesopotamia is the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and this is located in modern day Iraq. It is often referred to as the cradle of civilization because it was the first place where complex urban centers grew. So, with global prehistory, we started to see this transition from the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and then you had the Neolithic Revolution where people began to farm and use agriculture and domesticate animals and settling the land. And now we're going to start to see this creation of civilization and these sort of urban centers and cities. The history of Mesopotamia, however, um, is very tied. It's tied to this greater region, which is comprised of the modern nations of Egypt. You can see on the map Iran, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, and the Gulf states of Turkey. And so we often refer to this region as the Near or Middle East. Um, so it's quite an expansive territory, very large. So the rise of civilization occurred when humanity gave up hunting and gathering for a more stable existence of farming and herding and started to create more urban life. This region is credited with this adaptation. So when you look at the map, what you'll notice is that agriculture, this idea of agriculture, the need to be able to produce food to feed large groups of people, causes this sort of idea of urban development. And then rivers require complex irrigation systems, which would involve some sort of mass organization or administrative body of some sort. So you have these, cities or these city states that form and close to these river sources, but obviously to irrigate them this would require this complex organization, and we started to see that or play around with that idea when we were looking at Stonehenge with global prehistory. And so as a result, powers of government need to be involved and organized. And, so that's what we start to see during this period. And we also start to see more um, formed religions emerge as well. And so the land between the Tigris and Euphrates is also known as the Fertile Crescent Plain. City-states emerged between 4000 and 300 BCE. Each had its own gods and government. A social hierarchy began to develop. We'll see rulers, workers, specialized in skills beyond those needed for agriculture begin to develop as well. Construction and agriculture become more complex, and more complex housing for religious and administrative services start to develop as well. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the geography and the growth of these cities. Mesopotamia remains a region of stark geographical contrast. So you have vast deserts rimmed by rugged mountain ranges, and there are also some lush oases. Oasis. I'm not saying that right. Sort of speckled in there as well. Flowing through this typography are rivers, and it was the irrigation systems that drew off water from these rivers, specifically in southern Mesopotamia, that provided the support for the very early urban centers here. The region lacks stone for building, precious metals, and timber. Historically, it has been relied on Historically, it has relied on the long-distance trade of its agricultural products to secure these materials. The large-scale irrigation system and labor required for extensive farming was managed by a centralized authority. The early development of this authority over large numbers of people in an urban center is really what distinguishes Mesopotamia and gives it a special position in history of Western culture. Here, for the first time, thanks to ample food and a strong administrative class, the West develops a very high level of craft specialization and artistic production as well. We'll see happening in this region is we'll see huge temples and government buildings emerge. So we'll start to see more elaborate architecture. We'll start to see the development of more organized religion. We'll see that ritual and worship were often combined with government functions. And the people of ancient Near East were polytheistic and worshipped several gods and goddesses. So some of the themes that we're going to be exploring in relation to art is how does art begin to convey notions of power and authority, both religious and political? What stylistic conventions emerge in the art of these civilizations, and how do these conventions reflect and support political authority and religious beliefs? So you noticed this concept when we were doing those graphic organizers, this idea of stylistic conventions. And then we'll also see as we move further into the history of art that we'll also see innovations being made as well. Themes that we'll be looking at in this unit, power and authority. We'll be looking at this idea of sacred spaces, and again, really focusing on this notion of artistic conventions. So what we'll see happening during this period is that there are many different groups that come, or city-states that come into power, and they're constantly fighting and battling each other. So the first group we're going to be looking at are the Sumerians. So cities and city-states developed along the rivers of Mesopotamia between 3500 and 2340 BCE, and this was known as Sumer. These people migrated north and are credited with the invention of the first form of writing known as cuneiform. And these are pressed wedge-shaped symbols into clay that is often done with a stylus. So here's an example of cuneiform. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers are more unpredictable than the Nile River in Egypt, and we'll talk about that when we look at Egyptian art. Also, this region was susceptible to raids and invaders, which is why so many different groups ruled in this region. As a result, because of these uncertain conditions related to life, the ancient Near East never developed a reassuring religion. Which is quite different from what we see happening in Egypt in our next unit. Um, Sumerians are also credited with writing one of the world's first literary epics, known as the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this records the adventures of a legendary Sumerian king of Uruk and his lover Enkidu, and I know I'm saying that wrong, who dies, and Gilgamesh sets out to find the secret of eternal life. At its height, the Sumerian civilization included more than a dozen loosely ununified city-states fortified with walls, gates, and towers. Each had a population of between 10,000 and 50,000 inhabitants. So this is our first work of art we're going to be looking at, and it's two sculptures. In Mesopotamia, gods were thought to be physically present in the materials and experiences of daily life. Enlil, and it's spelled Enlil, was considered the most powerful Mesopotamian god during most of the 3rd millennium BCE. And he was often depicted or described as this raging storm or a wild bull. We will see bull imagery throughout other historical periods, so keep that in mind. While the goddess Inanna this is spelled Inanna, reappeared in different guises as the morning and evening stars. So deities literally inhabited their cult statues after they had been animated by the proper rituals, and fragments of worn statues were preserved within the walls of temples. So these aren't statues of gods, but the two statues that we're looking at, these are two statues of worshipers. But I wanted to talk about, the different deities and Mesopotamian gods, and again, sort of emphasize this idea of the polytheistic religion of many ancient Near Eastern city-states. So what you see here are two figures standing with clasped hands and this sort of wide-eyed gaze. They are considered worshipers. Um, these statues were placed in the square temple at Tel Asmar, and this is a location, and we're going to be learning about that temple, perhaps dedicated to the god Abu, A-B-U, in order to pray perpetually on behalf of the person it represented. For humans equally were considered to be physically present in their statues. Similar statues were sometimes inscribed with the names of rulers and their families. So in addition to cult statues of deities, which these are not, the citizens of these city-states would often have their own statue that was supposed to represent them and be placed in the temple. And again, we talked about this in class, the very wide eyes was a sort of sign of reverence and this sort of vigil worship. And so these statues served as stand-ins for the citizens so that they could um, go about their daily physical lives. So, as I told you before, these two figures were found in the temple. Art historians refer to these statues as votive figures, V-O-T-I-V-E. It's important to note that these are not images of kings and gods, but worshippers imploring the gods. So, one of the questions I want you to ask yourself is why would the Sumerians use these doll-like statues in their religious worship? So, think about that for a minute. Okay, and I think we talked about some of these when we were talking or doing these. Remember, we power sketched these two figures in class. They represented a means of offerings to the dead, their ancestors, and to the gods. And again, they served as surrogates for the worshiper, while the living person they represented went on with their daily lives. So that's really important for you to understand the function of these two statues and others like it. Actually, several figures were found at Tel Asmar, and so you see them all here represented. They're made out of limestone. We see images of both men and women. And these statues were thought to directly relate to an ancient Near Eastern devotional practice in which individual worshippers could set up images of themselves before a large, more elaborate image of a god. So these smaller figurines would sort of be set up around this larger cult statue of a deity or god. Again, figures were often inscribed with the names of the donor and possibly his or her accomplishments. The statues of Tel Asmar range in height from 21 centimeters to 72 centimeters. Of the 12 statues found, 10 are male and 2 are female. 8 of the figures are made from gypsum, 2 from limestone, and one very small one is made from alabaster. All the figures, with the exception of the one that is kneeling, are rendered in a standing position. And so these are some stylistic conventions we're going to be looking at. Thin circular bases were used as supports, and large wedge-shaped feet provide the larger statues with added durability. So you can kind of see here they have these kind of thicker feet. So I forgot to set my screencast-o-matic so that it would record longer. So it's going to end in about 30 seconds. So I'm going to have to pick back up with this. So there is going to be a part 2 where I pick up with the votive statues from Tel Asmar. So stay tuned.